Hi everyone, I'm Bhante Sujato. Welcome to Dhammathreads, and I'm here with Simon Power to talk about some verses from the Theragāthā, the verses of senior monks. And you can read these on sort of Central if you're interested. The verses we're going to be looking at today are 4.5, Jambuka. So here's the verses. For 55 years I wore mud and dirt, eating one meal a month. I tore out my hair and beard. I stood on one foot. I rejected seats. I ate dried out dung. I didn't accept food that had been set aside for me. Having done many actions of this kind which lead to a bad destination, as I was being swept away by the great flood, I went to the Buddha for refuge. See the going for refuge, see the excellence of the Dhamma. I've attained the three knowledges and fulfilled the Buddha's instructions. So this set of verses, 4 verses here, has, I guess, some of the characteristics that we find from the Theragāthā verses, in that it's very personal. It's talking about someone's direct experience, and it's talking about, if you like, it's a redemption narrative, talking about from how we went from a place of darkness to a place of light. However, it's also a bit unusual in the kind of intensity of the ascetic practices which he's describing. Now, obviously, these ascetic practices are very reminiscent of the practices done by the Bodhisattva in the 6 years before his enlightenment, and generally speaking these were the practices done by the Jains as well as other ascetic groups in India at the time. Actually there were many different ascetic groups. These days the best known are the Jains, since they're the main ones who survived, and these are kind of classic practices. For 55 years wearing mud and dirt, in other words didn't have any robes, right? Just going naked and not bathing. And this is a classic Jaina practice, that the monastics, the strictest ones, would not wear any clothes and not bathe for 55 years. And understandably they had a lot of problems with doing things like going for alms round in villages, and people didn't necessarily like seeing all of these naked, dirty, filthy, stinking monks coming in, and so they'd throw rocks at them and so on to get rid of them. Eating one meal a month. Crikey, that's not much. Yeah? 1 meal a day, okay, 1 meal a week, well, all right, that's getting a bit extreme. 1 meal a month. I tore out my hair and beard. Again, classic Jaina practice. Instead of shaving their hair and beard, they would tear it out by the roots. Standing on one foot, rejecting seats. Again, these classic ascetic practices still done today. He ate dried out dung. Wow. Cow dung. Again, one of the things which is said that the Buddha did, or the Bodhisattva did, before his enlightenment. He looking back from his later time, after his enlightenment, he realized that these acts lead to a bad destination, which is an interesting thing to say. They're not just useless. Right? In the Buddha's first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Buddha said they are anatta sannihito, is pointless. But here they're even worse than pointless. They're actually harmful. And you know, one of why are they harmful? Well, I think for a couple of reasons. Most importantly, because they come from wrong view. And in the Bodhirajakumara Sutta, the Buddha says that before he was enlightened, he had the wrong view that pleasure was to be gained through pain. Right? And so when you have this idea that pleasure is to be gained through pain, then you do all of these kind of practices hoping for pleasure later. And it's really that wrong view which makes these things so harmful. But of course, in addition to the wrong view about them, there's also the practices themselves. I mean, simply having the intention to inflict suffering is actually an unwholesome intention. Even though you might be wanting to have, you might think that it's the right thing to do, but actually what you're doing is torturing yourself, and that's not a good thing. So while these first verses are very idiosyncratic, very personal, then the last verse is quite one of the kind of stock phrases, and these are some of the things which we find in a number of Theragāthā verses, is that kind of celebration of realization, of that going for refuge, seeing the Dhamma, attaining the three knowledges. Of course, the three knowledges being recollection of past lives, the clairvoyance, seeing beings being born according to their karma, and the realization of the ending of all defilements. Jambuka went through a real journey, and we can be very glad for him that he no longer has to wear the mud and dirt, and that at quite an advanced age, right, after 55 years, so he's probably in his 70s, he found the Dhamma and was able to finally found some peace. So Simon, what did you think of these verses?
I've loved the insight into the early practices that people had undertaken, and gave me a better understanding of why the Buddha rejected those practicings.
Okay.
Eating dried out dung was not something that I'd heard of before as a spiritual practice, so I was kind of enthralled to read it here. You called it a redemptive story.
I guess so, yeah.
Which it is, but I also saw it as a kind of story of conversion. And I know that there were plenty of followers of the Buddha who rejected their Brahmin or Jain traditions. So what degree do you think this stands in for a kind of conversion story that might have been related to other people from different backgrounds in the Buddha's time?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a kind of a strong element of that within the early Buddhist texts. I mean, one of the defining features of the early Buddhist texts as a whole is that they were produced in a non-Buddhist context. Right? They were produced within the complex, multi-faith society, which was ancient India at the time. Of course, most of our later scriptures are all produced within a Buddhist context. You know, it's Buddhists speaking to other Buddhists. So in these early texts, we have a lot of this relationship between Buddhism and other religions. So of course there's an implied criticism of the Jaina practices, which we find in there, Jaina and other early, other religious movements which were present at the time. It's not sort of explicitly presented as that kind of conversion narrative, right? He's not actually saying Jainism is bad and you should become a Buddhist, but he's talking from his own perspective, and this is what happened, and this is why he shifted, and that's how he found that peace. You know, I think it's important to recognise that even though these practices are very extreme and quite harmful, it's also, Jainism and these other religious movements have a lot in common with the Buddha. And there are many, many things which were kind of assumed sort of common ground in terms of living a life of simplicity, living a life of contentment, living a life of non-harming of any animals and creatures and so on, living a life of restraint, all of those things. So there's actually much, much common ground between Buddhism and Jainism. But the main problem that the Buddha had, of course, is the teaching of not self, which is different from the Jaina teaching of the jiva or the soul. And these practices of self-torment, which I think the Buddha was opposed to.
And it says in the poem that it leads to a bad destination. What is that destination?
Well, it could be, there's a number of bad destinations, but essentially in Buddhism they distinguishes between the duggati, is the bad destinations, and the sugati is the good destinations. Sugati is essentially the human realm, and any of the higher realms and heaven realms and so on. The duggati, anything below the human realm, from the animal realm and so on. I mean, there's some suttas where the Buddha talks about doing various ascetic practices leading to rebirth in the animal realm. So you can see it's a kind of animalistic lifestyle in some ways, right? Going naked and not bathing and so on. So perhaps leading to rebirth in the animal realm.
Especially after eating all that dung.
Well, exactly, yeah. Again, being a very animalistic practice,
Well, thank you very much. Such an interesting verse, and I thank you for your interpretation.
Thanks a lot, Simon. Thank you for joining us, and hope to see you for another Dhammathreads soon.